Long before airplanes, strange stone structures stood in places where no city should have needed them. Their runways were too straight, too long, and too exposed to be accidental. They appear in old maps, forgotten paintings, and ruined drawings from centuries before flight was supposedly possible. Yet they resemble airports with unnerving precision. The official story says aviation began with the Wright brothers in 1903. But these images force a dangerous question. What if the story is missing its first chapters? Because hidden in the architecture are clues, landing strips, guidance markers, terminal-like halls, and raised platforms built with a purpose that still feels modern. Some researchers call them symbolic ruins. Others insist they are evidence of a technology and transport system deliberately pushed out of history, and if that is true, then the past we inherited was not merely forgotten. It may have been edited, cleaned, and carefully repackaged. The first clues come from places far from each other: Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Different cultures, same impossible design language. On some sites, broad paved corridors lead toward open plains as if built for arrivals. Nearby, circular structures look less like temples and more like traffic control points. The surface details are worn away, but the geometry survives. Angles, alignments, and long approach paths remain visible even after centuries of erosion. That is why these places disturb historians. Random ruins do not repeat this way. Intentional infrastructure does, especially when it serves movement. One researcher traced a pattern in which these structures always faced open horizons, as though waiting for vessels that needed space, wind, and visibility. Another noted repeated terraces, elevated aprons, and stone ramps. In any ordinary ruin, they would seem decorative. Here, they look operational. If people built these for ceremony, why do they mimic logistical design so closely? Why do they appear where transport would matter most? The deeper investigators looked, the stranger the silence became. There were no clear builders, no surviving manuals, and no accepted explanation for the scale. Instead, there were fragments, legends of sky roads, accounts of loud arrivals, and stories of objects descending from the heavens into prepared grounds. That is where the airport theory begins to harden, not with a single discovery, but with a chain of suspicious similarities too consistent to ignore. The question is no longer whether the shapes exist. The real question is why so many ancient places look built for arrival, departure, and control. Even the terminology becomes unsettling. Words for ports, stations, and platforms appear again and again, as if the builders understood movement long before airplanes. And if those terms were later reused for ships, trains, and planes, then maybe the language itself is a fossil of an older system. Now the old world airports take on a darker meaning. They may not have been fantasy at all, but remnants of a network someone wanted forgotten. To understand them, we have to slow down and examine the first site carefully. Its layout is the kind of thing officials would map, not poets. Wide flat surfaces, symmetrical edges, and separate access points all hint at a place designed for organized movement across distance. The more you study the edges, the more you notice deliberate planning. Nothing about these sites feels incidental, broken, or purely ceremonial. And that is the real mystery at the heart of this story. Who built these places? What moved through them? And why were they erased? In the next chapter, we descend into the first major site and trace its design line by line. Because once you see it, the official timeline starts to crack. Our descent begins at the first site, where stonework and geometry appear far too deliberate to be accidental. The layout suggests movement, control, and some vanished purpose. What looks like a ruin is only the surface. Beneath it, old maps and travelers' notes hint that this place once handled arrivals on an enormous scale. The first clue is scale. These platforms are too broad for homes, too ordered for temples, and too exposed for ordinary civic life. Along the edges, channels cut into the rock resemble drainage, but they are spaced like guidance lanes. That is where the comparison to an airport begins to feel dangerous. No wheels are visible, yet the surface wears in long, repeated lines. Something heavy once came and went here, leaving a pattern that looks procedural. Nearby, carved slots line up in pairs, like anchor points or restraining markers. Builders of a ceremonial site would never need that kind of precision. Then comes the hardest question. Why were such places built in remote, elevated, and windswept terrain? That choice makes sense for visibility, not for worship. In the old records, there are hints of controlled access, guarded thresholds, and designated approach paths. That language sounds less like pilgrimage and more like logistics. One section even appears designed to separate incoming traffic from outgoing traffic, as if flow mattered above all else. That is a modern principle hiding inside an ancient shell. Supporters of the orthodox view call these features symbolic, but symbols rarely leave behind such strict symmetry, repeated dimensions, and functional wear. The measurements matter. Repeating spans suggest standardized construction, the kind needed when many users must interact with a place in the same way. Some passages are too low for procession, yet ideal for guided entry beneath a protective roof. That detail points toward enclosed operations, not public spectacle. Look closer, and you find wear concentrated where something would land, pivot, or be steadied. Random foot traffic does not create that kind of concentrated pattern. This is why the site resists simple labeling. It behaves like an interface between arrivals, storage, and departure, all hidden beneath ritual language. And yet the official narrative insists on a purely sacred function. That claim grows weaker when the architecture keeps behaving like engineering. The turning point comes from surface chemistry. Certain stones show polish and abrasion where repeated contact would have been unavoidable over long periods. That kind of wear implies repetition, not ceremony. It implies a place designed for many passages, many adjustments, and many controlled stops. Even the surrounding landscape seems selected, not merely occupied. The terrain opens in a way that favors approach corridors and distant visual reference. That matters because navigation is not built only with walls. It is built with sight lines, elevation changes, and the psychology of controlled arrival. Here, the evidence starts to converge. What was dismissed as decorative oddity now looks like a coherent system with traffic discipline at its core. The deeper we go, the more the structure resembles a forgotten machine rather than a sanctuary. Its components work together with unsettling purpose. That unsettling feeling comes from the mismatch. The dates assigned to the site do not comfortably explain the precision it preserves, and when one site stops making sense, investigators begin seeing a pattern across others. The same logic appears again, in different regions, under different names. That pattern is what makes this story so difficult to dismiss. The question is no longer whether the site was functional, but what civilization built it. In the next site we will follow the measurements, the where, and the hidden access routes even further, because the deeper the evidence runs, the harder the timeline is to defend. But the measurements did not point to a fantasy. They pointed to deliberate engineering, the kind that begins with drainage, grading, and controlled access across a massive site. That's where the story shifts from symbolism to logistics. If a structure was designed for repeated arrivals, departures, and crowd movement, its footprint would look familiar to any airport planner. The first clue is scale. These places were not built for a lone ritual or a short visit. They required circulation space, staging areas, and controlled entry points. And once you notice the traffic flow, you see why the old timeline becomes unstable. The supposed era of primitive builders does not explain such disciplined site management. A genuine transport hub needs support structures, not just a dramatic centerpiece. Storage, repair zones, and waiting areas all leave different marks, and those marks were being found. Some passages were too narrow for ceremony and too practical for spectacle. They looked engineered for moving people and equipment with minimal delay. Even the approach roads mattered. Long, straight alignments often reveal a site meant to receive movement from afar, guiding visitors before they ever reach the core. That kind of alignment is hard to dismiss. It suggests planning beyond local utility, almost as if the entire complex served a regional network of arrivals. Then came the question of water. Airports, even ancient ones, cannot function without drainage, runoff control, and protected surfaces beneath the traffic. In several places, the pavement wore in patterns that made no sense for foot traffic alone. The abrasion suggested repeated rolling loads and constant repositioning of heavy structures. That detail matters, because wear patterns are one of the hardest things to fake. They record function over time, and they preserve behavior better than legends do. The hidden access routes reinforced the same pattern. Corridors bent away from public view, then rejoined the central platform like service roads behind a terminal. And when those routes were mapped together, a surprising geometry appeared. The site was built around movement, not stillness, with thresholds placed at calculated intervals. At that point, the old labels became a problem. If the remains were only temple foundations, why did they behave like an operational campus with traffic logic? The answer may lie in how much was removed. Once walls, fittings, and surface features disappear, an airport can look like a ruin, and a ruin can be relabeled as anything. That is why the missing infrastructure matters so much. A site stripped of its upper layers can still preserve the logic of movement beneath the surface. Researchers began comparing this pattern with other erased sites. Again and again, the same priorities appeared: access, staging, containment, and direct routes between zones. The pattern was too consistent to ignore. Different locations, different legends, same underlying architecture, as if a common design language had been buried on purpose. And that buried design language points to capability. Whoever built these places understood long-span planning, load distribution, and the choreography of many moving parts. That level of coordination is exactly what makes the official story fragile. The more precise the remains become, the less convincing the simple, shortened timeline appears. Then there is the matter of access control. Gates, choke points, and layered thresholds are not accidental. They are signs of managed traffic and restricted entry. If these were only ceremonial spaces, such control would be overbuilt. If they were transport nodes, however, the control logic becomes exactly what you would expect. So the question is no longer whether the site was elaborate. The question is whether the label we inherited was chosen to hide what the structure really did. Because once you follow the movement, the where, and the hidden routes, the old world stops looking static. It starts looking like a network of engineered arrivalgrams, and that is where the next site becomes crucial. Its measurements, access traces, and layered construction may push the case even further than this one did. The next site opens like a contradiction in stone. Its layout suggests arrivals, but the setting is far from any known airfield history. At first glance, it looks ceremonial, but the symmetry, access routes, and deliberately cleared ground hint at movement, not worship alone. Researchers noticed that the central space is not random. It behaves like a planned landing field, with edges that channel attention inward. Then come the access traces. They are not broad tourist paths, but narrow, repeated lines worn into the ground by purposeful traffic. Those traces matter because they suggest handling, staging, and waiting. In other words, the place seems designed for arrival procedures. And then the layers appear. Different construction phases sit on top of one another, as if the site was updated, repaired, and reused. That matters more than style. Reuse implies value, and value implies a function important enough to preserve across generations. The old maps deepen the puzzle. When the location is marked, it appears alongside routes, boundaries, and other sites tied to controlled access. The markings are not casual annotations. They read like directions for people and cargo, pointing toward a role beyond local settlement. Around the site, supporting structures appear in measured intervals. They form a pattern that feels less like random ruins and more like traffic management. In that pattern, movement is organized before arrival. The design seems to separate approach, pause, and entry, as if coordinating a sequence. That sequence is exactly what a landing system needs. A platform without control is useless. A platform with control becomes infrastructure. Even the terrain around it seems chosen. Natural slopes and open sight lines would have helped anyone arriving from above or at speed. That is why the surrounding geography cannot be ignored. It acts like a silent part of the engineering, not mere scenery. When you combine the terrain with the traces on the ground, the hypothesis becomes harder to dismiss. This was not simply inhabited land. The case also grows stronger when similar forms appear elsewhere. Separate locations repeat the same logic: broad approach, defined center, and managed edges. That repetition is crucial. In archaeology, a single strange site can be dismissed, but a pattern across distance demands explanation. Here the explanation shifts from mystery to system. The question is no longer whether the site was built for arrivals, but how many arrived there. That question forces a bigger timeline. If the structures are older than accepted aviation history suggests, then their purpose must belong to another framework entirely, and that is where the evidence becomes unsettling. The more carefully the site is studied, the more it resembles a lost technical tradition. That tradition may have been erased, not because it was invisible, but because later history had no place for it. The site's measurements still matter. Precise dimensions often survive even when the language of builders is gone, and measurements rarely lie. If those dimensions align across sites, the implication is enormous. We may be looking at an old network, not isolated oddities, and once a network exists, the story changes completely. The mystery is no longer what the space was, but who once depended on it. Because if these were airports before airplanes, then history did not simply forget a few ruins. It erased the beginning of a different technological age. If these structures really functioned like airports, then their final disappearance was not random. It was a deliberate severing of memory, technology, and purpose. What remains today are fragments, towering walls, precise channels, vast open grounds, and structures built with the logic of traffic, not ceremony. For centuries, visitors saw temples, fortresses, or tombs, but the scale says something else. These were built to receive, sort, and send. That difference matters. A temple is built to be worshipped, but an airport is built for circulation, transfer, and departure. And once you notice that logic, the mystery deepens. The surviving ruins begin to look less like mythology and more like infrastructure. The first clue is scale. These places were too large for ordinary traffic, yet too engineered to be accidental monuments. The second clue is access. Many of these sites are positioned where land, water, and open space meet, exactly where transport systems naturally gather. The third clue is control. Narrow passages, gates, and terraces suggest managed movement, as if people or cargo were being processed in stages. Even the surfaces are telling. Smooth platforms and worn lanes imply repeated use by wheels, sledges, or other moving devices long lost to us. This is why the standard explanations fail. If these were only ceremonial sites, then the engineering is absurdly overbuilt for symbolism alone. And if they were not ceremonial, then the question becomes unavoidable. What kind of civilization needed transfer points like these? A civilization with logistics. A civilization that understood arrival, routing, storage, and departure as essential parts of power. That would explain why the ruins feel planned at a system level. One site does not make a theory, but dozens begin to form a pattern. Across continents, the same architectural language appears again and again. Different cultures perhaps, but one shared function hidden beneath the surface. The official record prefers a simpler story. It asks us to see these places as sacred, even when their geometry keeps whispering otherwise. And yet, sacred sites do not require built-in traffic geometry, repeated access lanes, or huge transfer grounds waiting to be used. The erasure also makes more sense now. A society capable of these systems would be dangerous to any later power that wanted a cleaner timeline. If these were airports, then they imply a vanished network of movement before our accepted technological age. That network would rewrite trade, travel, and contact itself. That is why the ruins feel so unsettling. They are not just broken buildings, they are the remains of a world organized around capabilities we no longer admit. And once that possibility is admitted, every demolished wall becomes evidence, every buried lane becomes a clue, every erased platform becomes testimony. The story is no longer about whether planes existed in the modern sense. It is about whether humanity once built flight support systems, then lost the blueprint. History's silence is not proof of absence. In places like these, silence can also mean removal, hiding, or replacement. So the real puzzle is not why the ruins survive. It is why the civilization that built them was so thoroughly renamed, reclassified, and forgotten. Because once you see these monuments as airports before airplanes, the past stops being a smooth line. It becomes a battlefield of lost technologies and hidden functions. And that is the final shock. The world did not merely lose airports. It may have lost proof that another age of human capability once stood here and was erased.